What if I told you there was once a man whose courage was so unbreakable, the most powerful king in Europe vowed not just to kill him, but to erase him from history itself? Not a quiet execution, not a swift blade, but a death designed to make the strongest men flinch and the boldest nations think twice before daring to rebel. His name was William Wallace, and while Hollywood gave you a hero's ending, the truth is far darker. Hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started with the disturbing reality that history tried to soften. To his enemies, Wallace was a traitor, a wild Scottish knight whose defiance threatened the entire English crown. To his people, he was a symbol living proof that the heavy cavalry of England could be beaten, that freedom was not just a dream whispered in the hills. And to King Edward, the man called Longshanks Wallace was something far more dangerous than a soldier. He was an idea. And ideas once born can be harder to kill than any army. By the summer of 1305, Edward's patience had rotted away. He had seen Wales broken, had forced noble after noble to bend the knee. But Scotland was a wound that refused to close, and at its center stood Wallace, still resisting even as former allies bowed to the English throne. This was no longer about military victory. This was about humiliation, public, undeniable, unforgettable. Wallace's capture did not come from an epic final battle, but from something colder: betrayal. Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot who had once fought for the same cause, handed him over near Glasgow. The bounty was generous, but the reward was more than gold. It was survival in a land where even the rumor of loyalty to Wallace could mean your own death. The journey south to London was no silent prisoner's march. Wallace was paraded like a trophy, dragged through town after town, so that every villager, every merchant, every child could see the Scottish traitor. It was psychological warfare in its purest form, the slow erosion of a man's dignity before the killing blow. Westminster Hall, August 23, 1305. The air was thick with the heat of bodies packed shoulder to shoulder. The trial was spoken in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't understand, but understanding wasn't the point. He was charged with treason against a king he had never recognized, with murder, for killing soldiers who had occupied his homeland, with sacrilege for striking English clergy who served as agents of the crown. The verdict was decided before the first word was spoken. When given a chance to speak, Wallace's voice cut through the theater of accusation. He could not commit treason, for he had never been Edward's subject. A ripple went through the hall. Defiance even here, even now. But it sealed what was already inevitable. Edward's judges had no interest in mercy. The sentence was not just death, it was annihilation. Wallace would be drawn through the streets hanged, but cut down, alive, disemboweled, while conscious beheaded, then his body quartered and sent to the corners of the realm. Every step had meaning. Dragging meant disgrace. Partial hanging meant heaven's rejection. Burning the entrails meant destroying the seat of compassion. Quartering meant erasing a man from the map. At dawn, London awoke to celebration. Vendors sold pies and ale. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. The authorities had built not a scaffold of justice, but a festival ground of cruelty. Wallace was tied to a wooden hurdle, the ropes biting into his skin, the cobblestones scraping him raw as horses dragged him from the tower through the busiest streets of the city. The crowd was electric. Some jeered, others laughed, some simply stared in fascinated horror. Every turn of the wheels, every jolt of the hurdle was calculated to make his suffering last. And through it all, witnesses swore. Wallace kept his eyes fixed on some distant point, whether it was defiance, resignation, or the last scraps of hope no one could say. But he did not cry out. Smithfield awaited a place where countless had died, but none in quite this manner. The scaffold loomed like a wooden altar built not for sacrifice to the gods, but to the unblinking eyes of a blood-hungry crowd. Wallace was hauled up his body, already battered from the journey, yet the day's true torment had only just begun. The first act was the hanging. Not the swift drop that snaps the neck in merciful seconds, but the slow choke rope cutting into flesh lungs clawing for air. His face flushed purple veins standing out like cords, eyes bulging against the sky. The crowd roared at each convulsion, as though they were watching a brutal sport rather than the suffocation of a man. Before unconsciousness could claim him, the rope was cut. Wallace fell in a heap, gasping, his body racked with tremors. The executioner was not there to end his life quickly. He was an artist in agony, trained to keep his subjects hovering on the edge of death without letting them cross. A sharp blade flashed. The executioner knelt and without hesitation opened Wallace from sternum to navel. The air filled with the wet, sickening sound of steel parting flesh. Gasps mingled with cheers as steam rose into the summer air, a mingling of blood and heat. One by one, his internal organs were pulled free and held aloft for all to see. The crowd erupted as each was flung into the fire prepared beside the scaffold. The flames hissed and spat the smell of burning flesh, curling into the nostrils of every witness, searing the memory into their minds. Medieval belief held that the bowels were the seat of human compassion. Burning them before his eyes was meant to erase not just his life, but his humanity. In this theater of cruelty, symbolism mattered as much as suffering. Still conscious, Wallace's gaze swept the mob. Some claimed he tried to speak. If he did, his words were lost under the roar of voices, mockery, triumph, and perhaps a few hidden in the din who mourned. Finally, the axe was brought forward. One clean stroke separated head from body. The executioner raised it, high blood streaming down the haft, the face still set in that final, unknowable expression. The roar of the crowd was deafening, but the performance was not over. The body was methodically cut into 4 quarters, each piece held up like a grotesque prize, before being packed for its journey north to Scotland east to Berwick, west to Stirling, south to Perth. Each city would have its warning, each town square its grim reminder. The head was dipped in tar to preserve it, then carried to London Bridge, where it would be impaled on a spike. There it stood for years, a silent sentinel over the Thames, a symbol meant to intimidate, and instead to inspire those who still dreamed of Scotland free. For days after the execution, London was still buzzing tavern talk, thick with boastful retellings, vendors hawking crude sketches of the spectacle, apprentices swearing they had stood so close to the scaffold they could smell the tar. The authorities wanted this lingering noise. They wanted fear to travel as fast as gossip. Yet, in quiet corners among clerks who copied the writs among a few monks who had watched with lowered eyes, another kind of murmur began that something about the day felt less like justice and more like ritualized desecration. On London Bridge, the head leered over water gone gray with dusk gulls circling, as if paying court to a new and terrible patron. People crossed themselves when they passed, some from loyalty, others from instinct, a few from shame they could not name. The king's message was clear. This is what happens to ideas. But the river has a way of carrying stories both downstream and upriver, and the whispers began to drift north. In Scotland, the arrival of the severed quarters played out like a macabre liturgy. They were set up on gates and market crosses guarded by soldiers who had been instructed to watch the crowd's faces more than their hands. Some stared in silence, jaws clenched hard enough to ache. Others pretended indifference. A few, in the iron habit of survival, made the sign of the cross and moved on. But at night, candles appeared beneath the grisly trophies, one here, 3 there, snuffed out by morning patrols, and rekindled the next dusk. Mothers murmured Wallace's name to sons who were learning to tie their first leather straps, not as a war cry, but as a warning about the price of courage. Priests balanced their homilies on a knife-edge obedience to authority, On the one hand, the sanctity of a people's soul on the other, aware that the wrong word could unmake a parish and unmake a life. Longshanks believed the psychology was foolproof. Transform a rebel into a road sign, point the way toward obedience, and the kingdom marches on. Yet, humiliation has a peculiar half-life. It decays into rage at a pace that rulers often miscalculate. Messengers from the border returned with reports that surprised the chancery clerks: fewer petitions to swear. Fealty more shepherds avoiding English patrols, local mills accidentally shorting tax grain, a sudden epidemic of doors that would not open when soldiers sought shelter from the rain. Nothing that would look like rebellion in a ledger, just the 1,000 paper cuts by which empires bleed. Most troubling was the whispered name on every wind-scoured hill, not Wallace, but the man many had doubted, Robert Bruce, who watched the horror of Smithfield, not as a full stop, but as a comma. Bruce had a talent for silence. He understood that words and worse proclamations could be filed, copied, carried back to London as evidence. So he measured his public loyalty like coins paid in a noisy marketplace, just enough to be heard, never enough to be counted twice. In private, he read the room of Scotland like a strategist reads terrain. Wallace's death had not warned the country. It had stripped it bare. The nobles who had chosen accommodation now looked shabby like guests who stayed too long at a failing feast. The common folk carried a new stiffness in their shoulders, the kind that does not go away until something breaks. Bruce did not yet grasp when or how to move, but the image of entrails tossed to the fire had welded something in him, less fury than resolve, the colder metal from which long campaigns are forged. English officials doubled down. More spies were paid, more lists compiled, who laughed at the wrong joke, who skipped mass the day Wallace's quarter arrived, who spent too much time alone with parchment and ink. Sheriffs were ordered to make examples, but examples require audiences, and people had learned how not to watch. The Crown's legal machine whirred with the energy of men certain of their virtue. Yet, even in London, a few parchment-thin doubts appeared in the margins. A clerk copied the trial record and paused over the Latin for traitor, his quill hovering as he considered the oddity of treason without allegiance. He dipped the nib and wrote the word anyway. The law is a great drum, hollow, inside thunderous when struck, and that day it sounded as intended even as hairline cracks began invisibly to form. Abroad, the ripples of Smithfield struck different shores with different force. In Paris, a courtier told the story over wine, shivering theatrically for effect, while taking mental notes about English temper. In Rome, a minor prelate frowned at the absolutism of a punishment more theatrical than pastoral, suspecting that such excess was less about God's order and more about the king's nerves. In Flanders, merchants asked quiet questions about whether English wool might become more expensive if Scottish resistance hardened rather than dissolved. Reputation, like coin, circulates, and there is always a discount for goods that smell faintly of smoke. Meanwhile, in abbeys and farmhouses, a parallel record was being written, not on vellum but in memory. A shepherd told his child that he once saw Wallace move like a storm through a glen, driving back men on horseback with nothing but timing and terrain. A widow remembered bread left at her door during a winter patrol and swore it had been his doing. None of these fragments would satisfy a historian, but they were more stable than any charter because they could not be seized and carried south. Ballads sprouted like thistles low, at first sung under the breath while mending harnesses, and each retelling made the hero taller, the chains heavier, the executioner crueler. Myths are scaffolds. They allow a people to climb above their fear long enough to look around. Back in London, the head weathered. Tar preserved the outline, but not the man, and the gulls were merciless editors. Yet something strange happened. Travelers paused beneath the spike not to admire English justice, but to trace a line between what had been done and what it said about those who ordered it. A few left flowers at the foot of the bridge post, not many and always swept away before noon, but enough to unsettle the guards who had imagined their job was simple. Power rarely admits it is rattled, so it speaks louder. New proclamations thundered from the chancery about the king's mercy toward loyal Scots and his iron toward the rest. No one missed the second part of the sentence. Bruce's turning point did not arrive with fanfare. It came like most consequential decisions do in the narrow hours before dawn when the mind is too tired to perform and therefore tells the truth. He looked at a map not as a geography of rivers and castles, but as a chart of attention where England could not look and strike at the same time, where supply lines could be pinched, where loyalty might be extracted, not by oath, but by relief from taxes, from garrisons, from the humiliation of being watched. He did not need Scotland to love him at once. He needed Scotland to breathe again. Wallace had taught him that terror can fracture iron, but will always harden steel. The trick was to find the steel. The legacy of Smithfield thus resolved into a paradox. The more completely the English crown attempted to erase Wallace, the more indelibly it etched him into the Scottish mind. Executions are supposed to end stories. This one began 10 new ones about law, and its limits about kings and their fears about what a people remembers when it has nothing else left to hold. In the years to come, men would ride because of what they had smelled that August day. The tar, the smoke, the iron in the air, and because of what they had not seen, mercy. The bridge kept its awful sentinel, but the river beneath carried the future and upriver in the high country of hard weather and harder resolve. Something that looked very much like a reckoning began to gather its breath. Winter in the Highlands does not forgive hesitation. By the time the first snows laid their white seal across the passes, Bruce was already moving in shadows. His forces were not armies, but threads thin, almost invisible until pulled tight. Messengers rode at night avoiding the main roads, where English patrols sought easy captures. Blacksmiths forged nails and arrowheads under the pretense of making plowshares. Every loaf of bread sent north was counted twice, once as sustenance, once as a declaration. The English garrisons, so sure in their stone keeps, began to feel the air change. Doors still opened for them, but less quickly. Smiles stayed on faces a moment too long, like masks that were hard to keep from slipping. The shadow of Wallace hung over these early maneuvers like a second banner. Men who had never met him spoke as if they had ridden at his side. His death was retold in campfires, with the details sharpened, polished, exaggerated, yet never softened. The hurdle dragging him through London's streets became a grinding wheel on which Scotland's will was honed. When recruits hesitated, older fighters would lean in and whisper, "Would you rather die in bed or under the rope they used on Wallace?" It was a grim kind of inspiration, but it worked. In London, Edward the Fionn aged in his victories. The ledger of captured castles and subdued nobles grew longer, but so did the list of border skirmishes, missing patrols, and vanished tax convoys. Every report that crossed his table seemed to carry a faint echo of Wallace's defiance. The king would never admit it, but the execution had not drained the poison, it had scattered it into the soil. He ordered more hangings, more public punishments, but England's own chroniclers noted a shift. These spectacles no longer drew the same raucous crowds. Perhaps cruelty repeated too often becomes a mirror in which people see themselves. Among Scotland's villages, the legend of Wallace acquired a sacred texture. Some claimed that the ground beneath the scaffold in Smithfield could not hold grass for years afterward. Others swore that a sudden wind had carried his final breath north, straight into the high glens. These were fictions, but useful ones. A people under occupation must find ways to turn wounds into weapons, even if only in their minds. And in those minds, Wallace's story became less about loss and more about inheritance, a debt not to be paid in coin but in continued defiance. Bruce learned to use the terrain as if it were an ally. Rivers that flooded English supply lines became silent comrades. Forests that hid rebel movement were treated as fortresses without walls. In this, he was Wallace's true student, not because he mimicked the man's campaigns, but because he understood the deeper lesson: to fight a stronger enemy, you do not match his stride, you make him stumble. Each victory, however small, was whispered back into the hills, where it became fuel for the next one. By the spring thaw, the English had begun to sense the shift. Their soldiers complained of boots worn through on endless marches to chase enemies they could not corner. Supply wagons arrived, light their goods lost to weather or miscounted by local laborers. And in the markets of Edinburgh and Perth, a dangerous thing reappeared: laughter. Not the reckless laughter of those who believe themselves safe, but the quiet knowing kind that says danger is worth the risk. It was the sound of a people remembering they had not yet been broken. Edward's counselors urged decisive action, but here the king faced his own shadow. The grand spectacle of Wallace's execution had been meant to set an example for all rebels. To repeat such a performance on every captured Scot would dilute its terror and risk turning cruelty into routine. Yet anything less might seem weak. The crown was trapped in its own theater, the curtain drawn, but the audience unimpressed. So the king hesitated, and in that hesitation the cracks widened. In the chronicles that would one day be written, these months would blur into lines of ink and dates. But for those who lived them, each week was a turning screw. A miller in Stirling hid sacks of flour for riders he never saw. A mother in Ayr taught her children a prayer that named no saints, only mountains and rivers. A blacksmith in Inverness deliberately weakened the hinges on a gate that faced the north wind. These were not battles, but they were victories, the kind that armies could not list and kings could not easily erase. When Bruce finally took the field in open defiance, the banners that lifted in the wind did not bear Wallace's face, yet he was there in every shout, every blade raised. The men knew they were not just fighting for land or for a crown, but to settle a debt that had been hammered into them by the image of a man tied to a wooden hurdle, eyes forward, unbowed. In their minds, the quartered body had reassembled not in flesh, but in will. Years later, when the tide of war had shifted, and Scotland stood closer to freedom than it had in decades old, fighters would still speak of Wallace as if he had only just fallen. The manner of his death, so meticulous in its cruelty, had failed in its one true purpose. Instead of erasing him, it had bound him to the nation's marrow, and so, in a way, Edward's greatest act of power had become his greatest mistake. He had made William Wallace immortal, not in life, but in the story that could never be killed. In the decades that followed, England's scribes recorded the Wallace affair as a triumph of royal authority, a cautionary precedent. Yet the ink on those parchments could not bind the reality outside their walls. Across Scotland, the name Wallace slipped from political rhetoric into something far more durable: folklore. Songs wove his deeds with threads of invention, but the core remained the defiance, the courage, the refusal to kneel. Children learned the verses before they could read, and in that oral memory the execution at Smithfield transformed from a moment of defeat into the cornerstone of a national myth. Edward's foreign envoys, tasked with smoothing relations abroad, found themselves navigating questions they could not easily answer. In Bruges, merchants spoke in low voices about the butchery of the Scot, and wondered aloud if such brutality might someday be turned on other restless provinces. In Rome, the spectacle was noted with a frown. Public dismemberment, though common enough in secular courts, was a discordant note when played by a monarch who styled himself as Christendom's defender. These murmurs did not yet shift alliances, but they seeded doubt's small fractures in the stone facade of English prestige. At home, the English public's appetite for grand executions began to wane. The sheer extremity of Wallace's death had set a high watermark of cruelty that few could match without seeming redundant or desperate. Some Londoners who had once jostled for a place at the scaffold now spoke of that August day with a certain unease, as if recalling an entertainment they wished they hadn't enjoyed quite so much. The human mind can accept almost any horror in the moment. It is the memory gnawing in the quiet hours that sometimes breeds regret. In Scotland, those memories were tended like embers. Monks in hidden scriptoria copied fragments of court records and smuggled them to sympathetic abbots, preserving the details not as legal evidence, but as sacred relics of resistance. The very language of the execution, drawn, hanged, quartered, took on a talismanic weight. It was repeated not to terrify, but to steel the resolve of those who would face similar fates. If Wallace endured it, they would say, "So can we." Thus, the Crown's chosen vocabulary of fear became perversely the rebels' lexicon of courage. As Bruce's campaigns deepened, the English commanders began to notice a troubling pattern. Captured rebels fought to the last, or found ways to end their own lives rather than be taken alive. The lesson was clear. Surrender to England meant a slow public destruction. This robbed the Crown of living trophies and forced them to confront a more elusive enemy, one that preferred martyrdom to captivity. In this way, Wallace's death had not just inspired rebellion, it had reshaped its tactics. The image of the quartered body also had an unintended theological echo. In a land still steeped in the rituals of the Church, the division and dispersal of Wallace's remains mirrored in grotesque inversion the sharing of holy relics. Where saints' bones were sent to spread blessings, Wallace's quarters were meant to spread fear. But human nature, ever stubborn, often finds the meaning it wishes to see. To some Scots, the sight of his remains was not a deterrent, but a blessing, a grim benediction that their cause was righteous enough to earn such an enemy. Meanwhile, in English courts, the precedent set at Smithfield began to weigh on the legal mind. To justify Wallace's fate, the charge of treason had been stretched across a border it had never before crossed. That legal stretch remained, and in time it would be used again, not only on Scots, but on Englishmen whose loyalty to the Crown was judged wanting. Quietly, a few jurists began to wonder if the Crown had sharpened a sword, it might one day turn on itself. The River Thames continued to flow beneath London Bridge, lapping at the pilings that held Wallace's head aloft. Travelers noted the way the tar-blackened features stared downriver toward the sea, as though daring the tides to carry his gaze to other shores. Children grew up with the head as a fixture of the skyline, and like all such fixtures it began to fade into the background. But in moments of unrest, when taxes rose too high, or soldiers overstayed their welcome, the memory of whose face had once crowned that spike came rushing back. Years turned into decades, and the physical traces of Wallace's end disappeared. The scaffold was torn down, the quarters rotted or burned, the head replaced by others. But the story proved harder to dismantle. It passed from voice to voice across generations, across wars, always adapting to the needs of its tellers. To some, Wallace was a warrior saint. To others, a cautionary tale of defying a power too great to fight. Yet, in every version, the core remained. He had stood, he had resisted, and he had paid the ultimate price without bowing his head. By the time Scotland would finally secure a measure of independence, Wallace's execution had transcended its original purpose entirely. Edwardus had intended it as a definitive punctuation mark, a full stop to the sentence of rebellion. Instead, it became a refrain echoing through centuries of struggle. The cobblestones that had scraped his body, the fire that had devoured his entrails, the spike that had held his head, all were gone. But the idea he embodied walked on a ghost in armor, whispering to every generation, "Some things are worth any cost." The further Wallace's death slipped into the past, the more it shed the specifics of time and place, becoming instead a parable. In alehouses, the telling began not with dates or kings, but with the image of a man facing the full weight of an empire without bending. The agony of Smithfield remained, but now it was framed less as a warning than as proof that endurance could outlast power. In this way, the execution the English crown had so carefully staged began to serve the very cause it had tried to destroy. In England's royal archives, the trial records gathered dust. Clerks tasked with maintaining them no longer remembered the heat of that August day, or the way the crowd's roar rolled like a tide against the stone walls. The documents were just another bundle of parchment bound with leather ties, one case among thousands. Yet, somewhere in Scotland, a ballad about Wallace's final hours was being sung to a child by a mother who had never seen London, her voice carrying a grief and pride so old it felt like part of the land itself. The irony was sharp. Edward's England had believed that cruelty could cauterize rebellion, sealing the wound. Instead, the spectacle had salted it, keeping it raw for generations. Every future act of English severity in Scotland would be measured against Smithfield. Some matched it, none erased it. Wallace had become the yardstick of oppression, proof that the crown would go to any length to break a subject, and proof, too, that a subject could refuse to be broken. Philosophers of a later age would point to Wallace's end as a turning point in the moral consideration of punishment. Here was a case in which the enormity of the suffering eclipsed the supposed crime, inviting reflection on whether justice could exist when its methods became more feared than the offenses they sought to punish. Medieval law had made treason a sin against the very order of the world. Wallace's defiance in that light became almost a holy act to those who rejected that order. In the Scottish mind, his death fused with the landscape. The Highland mists were said to be his breath, the red of the heather in autumn his blood. Such imagery was not literal belief, but a kind of cultural shorthand, a way of saying that Wallace's story was as much a part of Scotland as the rivers and mountains. To remove it would be to unmake the country itself. Even those who argued for peace with England invoked him, if only to acknowledge the weight of what had been paid. England, too, could not fully escape him. The very need to suppress his memory ensured its survival. Proclamations forbidding seditious songs about Wallace gave those songs their illicit allure. Punishing the telling of his story guaranteed it would be told in secret, its details shifting but its spirit intact. The state had unwittingly created an indestructible currency, one whose value increased the more it was outlawed. Over the centuries, the image of Wallace was painted and repainted to suit the needs of each generation. In times of war, he was the unbending warrior. In times of political struggle, the martyr to principle. In moments of national doubt, the reminder that Scotland had once produced a man who would not kneel. Each retelling trimmed and shaped the details, but the scaffold at Smithfield always stood in the background, a constant in the changing scene. Historians sifting through the chronicles found in his death a case study in the limits of deterrence. Fear can freeze action for a time, but it also breeds resentment, and resentment has a long memory. Wallace's execution proved that public cruelty is a gamble it may intimidate or it may immortalize. Edward had rolled those dice confident in the outcome. He had not reckoned with the human tendency to make saints of those who suffer greatly. Even in modern times, his story retains its unsettling power. Tourists in London stand on the cobbles where his final journey began, unaware of the blood that once streaked the stones. In Scotland, statues and memorials rise not just in his honor, but in quiet defiance of the fate meant for his memory. In classrooms, his name is spoken as part of a lineage of those who chose principle over survival, a lineage that stretches far beyond the borders of his homeland. And so, more than 700 years after that hot August day, the truth of William Wallace's execution remains a paradox. It was meant to obliterate a man and his cause to make his name a warning. Instead, it made him a rallying cry. The rope, the knife, the axe, the fire, all instruments of erasure etched him deeper into the stone of history. Longshanks won the day, but Wallace claimed the centuries, and in the silent spaces between heartbeats, his defiance still walks beside those who will not bow. If Wallace's execution teaches anything, it is that power misunderstands permanence. Kings believe their will can be carved into stone, yet stone erodes. What endures are not the proclamations or the punishments, but the stories told afterward, stories no crown can fully control. Edward's will was law in his lifetime, but Wallace's defiance became law in the hearts of those who heard it. A gallows can take a body, it cannot take the echo. The deeper truth is that Wallace did not win in the terms set by his enemy. He never saw Scotland free, he never returned home. Yet the frame of victory and defeat is too narrow to measure what he left behind. By refusing to submit even under the cruelty of Smithfield, he gave his people something rarer than safety, a reason to remember who they were. And that memory proved harder to break than any fortress wall. Edward's display of absolute authority now reads across centuries as a confession of fear. Only a ruler unsettled by the strength of an idea would go to such lengths to destroy its vessel. The dragging, the hanging, the disemboweling, each step was less about law and more about spectacle, a theater designed to reassure the throne that it still ruled unchallenged. But theater depends on an audience, and in this case, part of that audience carried the performance home as a different play entirely. Scotland's later victories owed as much to memory as to steel. At Bannockburn, when Bruce's outnumbered forces faced England's might, some of the men in the shield wall were boys when Wallace died. They had grown up under the shadow of his execution, taught to see surrender not as prudence, but as a living death. The English banners before them were not just the enemy of the day, they were the inheritors of the scaffold. In time, Wallace's name would be polished into legend, smoothed of its rough edges by poets and patriots. Yet, beneath the embellishments, the hard grain of truth remains. He was a man of flesh and flaw, who met the most deliberate cruelty his age could devise without yielding. Legends may inspire, but it is the knowledge that the legend was once a man that gives it weight. Every nation, if it survives long enough, will face the question of what to do with those who refuse to bend. Some will be broken in silence. Others will be broken in public, as Wallace was. The choice between the two says much about the confidence of a regime. Edward chose the public path, betting that fear was a more reliable foundation than respect. The bet did not pay. The case of William Wallace also casts a long shadow over the philosophy of justice. When punishment becomes so cruel that it shocks even the loyal, it ceases to serve its stated purpose. It no longer deters, it provokes. And once provoked, the memory of that cruelty becomes part of the opposition's arsenal, passed down like a treasured weapon. For the Scottish people, Wallace's death became more than history, it became a mirror. In times of hardship, they could look into it and see reflected not their present weakness, but the proof that weakness need not mean surrender. The mirror did not lie about the cost. It simply showed that the cost could be paid. Today, the site of his final moments bears no trace of blood or smoke. London has grown over it, layer upon layer, until the cobblestones that felt the drag of his body are hidden. Yet the absence is itself a kind of presence. The city may have erased the physical evidence, but the story survives unconfined by streets or monuments. You can still feel it in the quiet just before dawn, when the air over the Thames turns cold and still. And so the man who was meant to be forgotten endures reborn each time his story is told, each time a listener feels the chill of that August morning. Wallace's life ended on a scaffold, but his cause stepped off it and walked on, carried in the marrow of a nation. Longshanks is a name in the annals. Wallace is a presence in the blood. That is the final paradox. A king's power lasted for years, a rebel's defiance for centuries. And even now, when we speak of freedom bought at a terrible price, we speak, whether we name him or not, of William Wallace.